To me, Conan was Robert E. Howard at his best, his great character, and one of the great heroes of American popular literature.
I think screenwriting is very similar to writing comics. I mean, both are visual medium, and you'll find, especially today, that there's a lot of crossbreeding between comic book writers and artists and who are writing film and film writers who are writing comics.
Well, working with Stan Lee was probably the greatest experience of my life. I had worked for the competition, DC Comics, for 2 weeks. I met Stan on my lunch hour because he had me take a little writing test, and 10 minutes later he offered me a job. Half hour later I was back at DC and quit. I wanted to work for DC Comics for all these years, and I went to work for Stan for like 15. And we just had a wonderful experience. I would be there every morning on his right or left hand, and he would go over what he had written the day before on Spider-Man or Fantastic Four or Thor and show why he did what he did and where to place the balloons. I mean, all these things I'd never thought about as a comics fan. Where do you put the balloons? How much dialogue can you get in a balloon? Why do you avoid certain words, maybe because letters will close up and they'll look like dirty words. All sorts of strange things I never thought about. And it was just a real education. I was the one who had been the high school teacher for several years, but I never liked that. Stan was just a great teacher. And sometimes that would bear down a little heavy when it was on my work, but it was a wonderful experience. When I got the rights for Marvel to do Conan, we didn't have the right to adapt any stories. We just had the rights to use the character. It was deemed to be too complicated to get the rights to also adapt actual stories. I wasn't going to be happy until I got to adapt all these wonderful stories that I had read that I really loved. So I very quickly worked out with the literary agent state, Glenn Lard, to be able to pay a little extra. We ended up being able to adapt all the great stories, starting with the very fourth issue, which was Tower of the Elephant, one of the very best stories. And a little later, we were able to get the rights to the other writers, such as L. Sprague de Camp, who had written a lot of Conan stories. And eventually, we were able to adapt by the time I left in 1980, we had adapted almost everything that anybody had ever written about Conan in prose up to that point. Stan had set the style for the Marvel writing starting in the early 60s, and it was heavy on a lot of thought balloons. Spider-Man was always thinking about, am I going to be able to get a date? Am I going to be able to pay for this or that? And all this teen angst and so forth that Marvel became known for. And also for great big gaudy sound effects, splang and patang, and Stan was great at inventing sound effects. When I started doing Conan about 5 years after I was working there, I decided I wanted to do something a little different from the usual Marvel comic. I just wanted it to have its own identity, so I omitted the thought balloons, because in Howard's stories, you never really got inside Conan's mind. It never told you exactly what he was thinking. So I decided I'd have captions that would give a little of that, but I would not have any thought balloons, and I would not have any nonverbal sound effect. If somebody screeches, ee, that's okay, or a growl, but no nonverbals. And I'd been doing that for about a year or so. And then I had a story come in, and Stan looked at it and said, well, this would be really good if it had a big splang right here where these two swords are hitting. And I told him, I don't do nonverbal sound effects in the Conan comics. And he just stared at me in horror, because that was part of his style. But he figured, well, by that time, the books were doing pretty well. So he said, well, I guess you're onto something, so he let it go. And so I think there was one click that got in that somebody else put in once, but in all the thousands of pages I wrote, there was never a real sound effect or a thought balloon in Conan. And I thought that was kind of an interesting little experiment, very unusual for the time. Ed Pressman was interested in producing a Conan movie back in the middle 70s, 75, I guess it was. And a friend and associate of his, Ed Summer, who ran a comic book store and art emporium in New York, was also a friend of mine. And he came to me one day and said that Ed Pressman would love to get in touch with some of the people who controlled Conan. And I explained to him, well, they weren't speaking to each other. There were feuds, and that's been a problem. So I introduced him to the literary agent, and pretty soon they all got together on this Conan Properties Incorporated, and it was putting all these various people together into one group that made the Conan movie possible, even though it took another, 6 or 7 years before the movie actually got made. And the reason the comics were so important at that time was because the books were not coming out. The Conan books had come out from the middle 60s through the very late 60s from Lancer Books, but Lancer had gone into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So for a period of several years in the late 70s and so forth through the early 80s, the Conan stories were not available in prose form. So people only knew Conan through the comics, but luckily we were selling, 250,000 or so every month of Conan, and then we had the black and white book by the middle 70s, and that was a big item. So that, as much as anything, helped make the movie possible, even though, of course, the authentic Conan was always Robert E. Howard. Ed Pressman had paid me for the work on the Conan the Barbarian movie as story consultant, and that was fine with me. And I couldn't write another sword and sorcery movie for about 1 year, but nobody was asking me to anyway, so I figured, what the heck, I'll take 10 years of that. And so in the meantime, the first movie came out, and it was nice, and it did very well. And then one day, I get a call from Ed, and whom I got along with very well, but I hadn't heard from him for many months, and he's asking me, well, what are you doing these days? And I said, well, my partner Jerry Conway and I, we just wrote an animated sword and sorcery film for Ralph Bakshi called Fire and Ice, and we sold a couple of other movies. And he said, oh, that's very interesting. He says, we're about to start working on the second Conan movie, and I've got a young Australian, New Zealand director, Roger Donaldson, to do it. And he said, you should come in, you and your partner should come in, and we should talk about maybe you writing it, and because you've got this experience now, and and so forth. And I said, well, that's great, but I know that this is not what Ed called about, because he didn't know this. So I keep thinking, what is it he called about? I didn't get a lot of calls from producers, ordinarily. So just at a certain point, there comes this thing I call the Columbo moment, when it sounds like the conversation's over, and then Ed says, oh, by the way, like Columbo pausing at the door. He says, by the way, he says, you remember that I paid you for being the story consultant on Conan the Barbarian? And I'm thinking, oh boy, he's going to do it again for the second movie, and that's great. And he says, well, Dino De Laurentiis is now sort of in as, co-producing the second movie in a bigger way than the first. And he says, and he's supposed to pay me back all the expenses that I paid out for the first movie. And he's written me a check, but it's made out to you. So then I see the reason for the call. He needs me to sign the check over to him so he can cash it. And I said, sure, send somebody over. Maybe it took 10 minutes for somebody to get there. I said, I'll sign it. I got my money. No problem. But because of this accident of his needing me to sign the check, he found out that we had some movie credits, and as a result, writing the first several drafts of the second Conan movie. And it was just one of these weird accidents that I kind of lucked into.
Our goal when we came onto this was to do the Conan of the books and of the comics, which we didn't really feel had been accomplished in the first film. Roy and I discovered that it worked really well for me to write the first scene and get to the point where I was burning out. Then he would take over, and then he would continue writing until the point that he was burning out. Then I would be rejuvenated by that point and come back in. And so we just basically tag-teamed the script.
The movie contained a lot of things that were taken either from Howard's original stories or from the comic books. The most noticeable, Zula. A few years earlier, when I was writing Conan, I had wanted to make up a black hero. I felt there should be a black hero who was sort of like a Conan type. I gave him sort of vaguely hypnotic magical powers to make him sort of sword and sorcerer in one person. I was combining Mandrake the magician and his assistant Lothar into one character is what it really was. And I named the character Zula because the A ending in a lot of African language is masculine rather than feminine in English. So I thought Zula was a nice name, kind of typical comic booky name taken from Zulu. We wanted somebody different from the blonde Valeria in the first movie, so we thought a black Amazon warrior type would be very good, and we just stuck the name Zula on because it had been in the comics and it sounded kind of feminine, even though in the comics it had been a man, and it was supposed to be just a holding name, until we thought of something better. And people kind of began to like Zula, so we just ended up keeping it. So there are two Zulas. In the comic book, there's the man, and in the movie, there's the woman.
And as we were discussing between ourselves earlier, the casting of Grace Jones was something that I can't say that we were directly responsible for, but we came up with the idea of using someone like Grace Jones.
A lot of the scenes in the movie look like the scenes we wrote, and so forth. They're, they're not the same, but they're similar, or they're based on them, or whatever. But one scene that Richard Fleischer and Stanley Mann, between them, added totally was the introduction of Zula, in which you see her surrounded by an angry army of villagers, and she's tethered by one leg, and she's having to hold them off before he rescues her. And that was entirely their invention. Valeria was the love interest in the first movie, although she's only named in the credits. Somehow the name never quite made it into the movie as it got edited. But she was killed, so one of the comics I had done, in fact, the very last color Conan I had done, 10 years anniversary issue, had a sorcerer promising to bring his lady love, who wasn't Valeria but was the same kind of character, to life if he would do this, rather unpleasant task for him. And Conan was very tempted to do it. And at the end, he decides he can't do it. It just isn't right to do. So he forgoes the chance of bringing his beloved back to life and so forth. And near the end of as Jerry and I were working on the fourth draft, or really the fifth draft of the film, and Richard Fleischer was the director coming in, I remember telling Richard, I said, about this element, which they didn't want me to do originally, but I thought, gee, maybe it was time to add that back in. And he really sparked the idea, so I loaned him a copy of that comic book, and that ended up making its way into the movie and gave it a little bit of an extra motivation for Conan and a tie-in with the first movie, which I rather liked. In other cases, we had to leave things out. For example, we had wanted to have, in particular, I wanted to have that giant spider. It was supposed to be a spider the size of a pig. It was described by Howard in the story The Tower of the Elephant. And we had that all ready to go in the movie when we were working on it, and we had a meeting with an executive on another project at another studio, and he started to tell us about this sword and sorcery science fiction movie they were making, called Crawl, and it had a crystal spider in it, a giant crystal spider. So there went that idea, because it would just look like we were copying the other movie if it came out first. So we started thinking about what are we going to do instead of the spider. So we made up this idea of leeches. I guess the African Queen with Humphrey Bogart was part of the inspiration.
Conan was going to swim through a sewer that went under the tower, come up through a grating into a subterranean vault that had these holes in the wall that start off as little tiny holes where you see little tiny leeches. And then as you climb up the vault, the holes start getting bigger and the leeches get bigger until you're up near the very top of the vault and there's this giant hole. The big moment of this film, and it survived through every single draft and all the changes that we incorporated for Dino until
the end.
One of the recurring story points that we had was this battle of the gods, and one of the bad gods was going to be this god Dagoth that was the evil god.
He was the devil.
He was the devil.
Yeah.
And we wanted to have him have wings and fly, and we're going to have a big battle on top of a cliff and all of this. So I think some of that is survived in the comic book version.
All of it survived in the comic book version.
Yeah, well, it was sort of the alternate movie version. And we were going to have this spectacular fight where in midair with Conan having to hack away at this giant bat-like creature. And again, as I say, financially, this would have been enormous. Because we didn't have digital effects back then. And Dino, rightly, probably given the fact that opticals at that point were fairly crude, did not want to have any optical effects in the film if he could avoid it. So I guess we knew going along, as we were progressing along, that a lot of our bigger moments weren't going to survive. But most of the process of doing the 5 drafts was in whittling down the original visuals, to something that was more doable as a feature.